Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez, and I'm coming to you over YouTube, the YouTube channel Anton GF, from the city of Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today I have a conversation that I've been looking forward to for quite a while. One of the very first jazz trumpeters that I ever heard was Harry James, together with Louis Armstrong and Chet Baker, and a new book has just come out about Harry James. It's called Harry James, Trumpet Icon, and it was written by musician and author Chuck Pardue. And Chuck is joining us via telephone from his home near Portland, Oregon. Chuck, welcome to the Jazz Flashes podcast, and thank you for answering our call today.
Well, Anton, thank you for inviting me and letting me be a part of it. I had the privilege of watching a couple of your Bing Crosby podcasts, and they're very enjoyable, very thorough, and well done.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed those, and I appreciate your being here today and, giving me a chance to talk about one of my favorite trumpeters. We will use your book as an excuse to talk about Harry James. We don't really need an excuse, but it is a really good one. But before discussing the book, Chuck, I'd like to go back in time a little bit to talk about your interest in music. How did that begin, and how did it develop? How and when did you start playing the trumpet and singing?
Well, it's I'm one of the people that thoroughly believe that musical skill is in the DNA. And my father was a multi-instrumentalist and singer back in the 40s, had a band. He was a band leader, not a big name, but he had a regional band in West Virginia and Kentucky and Pennsylvania in that area. And in fact, there's a movie about my parents' courtship. Once in a while it pops up on Turner Classic Movies, but it's called You Were Meant for Me. And Dan Daly played my dad, and Jeannie Crane played my mom. And so I came by the musical skills or talent through the DNA of my folks. My dad's mother played the piano in the silent movies back in the 20s. And so when I was about 9 years old, my dad had decided that he was a frustrated pianist and decided he wanted me to be the piano player. And so I began taking piano lessons, and within a couple of months, it was really apparent that I didn't have the skills to play the piano. And so then when I was about 12 years old, I decided, I want to be a drummer. And it took me a couple of years before I realized that the manual dexterity issues that kept me from being a piano player also kept me from being an effective drummer. And so my dad had pretty much given up on the music thing with me. But one of the interesting things that happened, Anton, was I loved Gene Krupa. And I used to try to play along with him on the Sing, Sing, Sing recording with Benny Goodman. Mm-hmm. And one day my dad came home from the library, and he had the album of the 1938 Benny Goodman Carnegie Hall concert. And I was sitting there listening to the live recording of Sing, 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 and I was listening to Gene Krupa play it. It was a little different than the original. And every time that the trumpet solo started, there was something inside of me that it was kind of like grabbed me. And of course it was Harry James's trumpet solo at Carnegie Hall. And I just became enamored with that sound he had, because it wasn't like any other trumpet player before or after Harry James. He was so unique because he was able to take the jazz concepts and improvisational skills of Louis Armstrong and Muggsy Spanier and Dick Spiderback and add those to classically trained technique. So in the middle of his trumpet solo, he's playing this wild jazz solo, and all of a sudden he begins to quote Hungarian Rhapsody number 2. and I'm like, what in the world? And so I went to my dad, and I said, I want to be a trumpet player. And he said, no, you'll flop at that like you did the other instruments. And so I kept nagging him, and he was dying of cancer at the time. I was 14. And so one day I came home from school, and there was a new trumpet and a Harry James trumpet method laying on the dining room table. And I said, Dad, I need to get lessons. And he said, well, I don't work now. And he says, I can't afford to get you lessons. But he said, if you'll play everything that's in that book, and you'll practice and learn to play along with that guy's records over in the corner, you'll learn how to play. And the words that my dad gave me were, if you could ever get a sound like Harry James, you'll always get work. And that was 52 years ago, Anton. And by the time I was 17 years old, I was playing with seasoned veteran musicians. And I used to get hired because I was the kid that played like Harry James, or that sounded like Harry James. And so to this day, that's the style that I've adopted, and it's part of me. But that's how it all began.
You know, it's interesting that it was that 1938 Carnegie Hall concert, because that was also the very first time I ever heard Harry James. He was on that record that my dad had, and particularly that fantastic tour de force version of Sing, Sing, Sing with the Swing that, you know, I know by heart. I can't play an instrument, but I know by heart all the different sections of that wonderful recording. And that's how I came to the music of Harry James when I was probably about 11 or 12 years old, and I listened to that record. And there was something about the trumpet that really called my attention. I had heard Louis Armstrong before. I had heard Chet Baker as well, but there was something about Harry James that to me sounded different. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think is different about Harry James's style, and what was it that attracted you so much about his music?
Well, and I cover this in depth in the book, but as I mentioned, he was heavily influenced by Louis Armstrong, Muggsy Spanier, and to a lesser degree, Big Spiderback. And all three of those trumpet players had something different that they brought to jazz. And then Harry was trained classically. He was trained playing classical trumpet solos. When he was 12 and 13 years old, he's playing very difficult Herbert L. Clark and Del Steger solos. And so he had, by the time he was 13 years old, he had a near complete mastery of the instrument. And so when you add to that all of the jazz technique and all of the classical mastery, an ability to emote emotionally and to deliver a melody almost as though it were being sung. And really, in the histories of jazz, there's only been a handful of musicians that could do that. Johnny Hodges on alto saxophone could do that. Ben Webster on tenor saxophone could do that. And that is that they are able to deliver a melodic line as though it's being sung. And that makes Harry almost totally unique in all of jazz.
Would it be something similar to what we hear Tommy Dorsey doing on trombone?
Yeah, and it was a little bit different with Dorsey, because Dorsey was a lead player, and he had mastered the art of circular breathing as far back as the 20s. And so he could play long lines without taking a breath, the same way that Clark Terry did all those years. That he could literally play for minutes upon end without taking a breath. But I asked Harry one time when I was a teenager, I asked him about his sound, and he said, you know, kid, when my mom was in the circus, she was a trapeze artist and she was an operatic coloratura. And my mother told me, this is what she told Harry, and Harry's telling me, maybe I should play a song sometime the same way that she sings it. And Harry told me that whenever he played a ballad, all through his career, he was reciting the lyrics to the song in his head while he played. Mm-hmm. And you don't find too many guys that understand that concept.
I think that's an important thing to understand, really, because then you can impress something different upon the melody because you know what the melody means to you.
Sure. And I could hear, I have so many recordings, live recordings, and times that I went to go see Harry where you could see the difference in approach to a melody from night to night based upon his mood.
Mm-hmm.
And the emotions would be different. If he had a particularly bad day or something had happened that messed with his head, he didn't do much with the song. He would play it pretty straight. But if he'd had a particularly successful day, or if something, just had made him positive as he approached the song, he would take a totally different approach.
Now, one thing that I've always found interesting about Harry James, Chuck, is that he arose to prominence as a star soloist with Goodman. We've talked about the Carnegie Hall concert, for example, but
right.
That role as a sideman was not enough for him, and so he decided that he wanted to start his own band. And from everything I've read about Harry James and the beginning of his of those years where he started his band, things were rather hard for him when he started his own band. What kind of difficulties did he go through? He was a name soloist; people knew him, but still he had a difficult time starting that band, didn't he?
Well, and the reason for that, I go in again in the book. And the book right now is doing very well. And every review that I've gotten and notes that I'm getting from people all over the world, literally, are telling me that this book has accomplished for them what they've always wanted, and that is to answer the questions about Harry James, who he was and how he became who he was. Mm-hmm. But when he started his own band, and I have an entire section in the book called Harry Struggles with Success. And that is that he had started and earned his bones, as we say, as a jazz trumpet player. And when he would stand up, you could hear it in the radio broadcasts of the Camel Caravan. When Harry James would rise up from his chair to play, the audience began to make noise and applaud and cheer before he played a note. He had gotten very famous as a jazz trumpet player. But the problem was, when he started his band, jazz big bands were not doing well in general, with the exception of Basie and Ellington, and they were not commercial successes in those days as they were, as we would think of a Tommy Dorsey or a Glenn Miller or a later Harry James. They were jazz fans, and they had their niche market. And so when Harry started out, he was trying to crowd his way into a market that wasn't all that successful to begin with. And so he had to look for, as we say in the entertainment business, he had to look for a hook. He had to look for something that would set him apart and make him familiar to the record-buying public. And so that's a battle that he fought for over 2 years. He couldn't get commercial success with the record-buying people. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was he had hearkened to what his mother had told him. Son, why don't you play something the way that I sing it? And so he had wanted to record You Made Me Love You because, as with many of the men in America at that time, he had a crush on Judy Garland. Every guy in America loved Judy Garland. Judy Garland had recorded Dear Mr. Gable, You Made Me Love You in late 1938 in a movie. And so Harry wanted to record You Made Me Love You. And Columbia Records didn't want him to record it because he was a jazz band. And they didn't think it would sell. And so they continued to reject his desire to play You Made Me Love You. And so he went into a recording session one day and said, I want to do You Made Me Love You on the B side. And the A side was called A Sinner Kissed an Angel, which featured a vocal by Dick Haymes. And so the record company thought that Sinner Kissed an Angel was going to be huge. And so they said, we'll humor James and let him record this You Made Me Love You thing on the B side. So they went in to record it, and then the band went on the road, and they were playing one-nighters, and they were actually had been in Pittsburgh, and they were on their way to go play the Paramount This is in late 1941. Play the Paramount in New York. And as the bus approached the Paramount Theater early in the morning, because in those days, if you played the Paramount, your first show went at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you played till midnight. Mm-hmm. I mean, they did 6, 7, 8 shows a day. And so they pulled in to go to the Paramount, and there were lines literally for blocks of people wanting to get into the Paramount Theater. And so Harry and his manager jumped off the bus and approached the cop and said, "What's going on? Is there like a fire or something?" And the cop didn't know who he was and said, "No, these kids are here to hear Harry James play You Made Me Love You." And what had happened was Martin Block, who at WNEW had the Make-Believe Ballroom radio broadcast, mm-hmm. had been playing the B side instead of the A side. And all the kids fell in love with You Made Me Love You. And that was it. That cinched his success with the record-buying public in America.
That was a interesting choice because definitely you would think that A Sinner Kissed an Angel, which Sinatra also recorded with Dorsey, even though I really like the Dick Haymes version with Harry James, sounds like maybe a more commercial song on paper. But then you flip the record over, and there's something about that record, and particularly about the parts of Harry James's trumpet, that just sets that record apart from many others. I mean, it's instantly recognizable to me as a Harry James record. And, you know, one thing that I really, and I don't know, you may or may not agree with this, but one of the reasons why the sound of the Harry James Orchestra is so attractive to me is that he actually does straddle the fence between the sweet and the hot. You know, the more pop side and the more jazz side. And I think that he actually did find the right combination there in the early 1940s. A little bit, you know, not exactly in the same way, but a little bit in the way in which Tommy Dorsey did, because they were catering both to the people who wanted to dance and then also to the jazz fans.
Sure. And that, of course, that stayed with Harry the rest of his life. As I go into the book, I talk about the fact that he was a jazz trumpet player, and yet he had become a matinee idol because of his ballad playing and the movies and the television. And it's as though the part of Harry James that really was who he was, the jazz trumpet player, was suppressed so much during his career. And then later, when his name alone guaranteed a successful crowd, he struggled with the nostalgia thing. He didn't like playing his old hit recordings as he got older. In fact, I saw Harry many times, and although he included a little bit of You Made Me Love You into what we call the HJ Hits medley, I only saw Harry play You Made Me Love You one time. He never played it. He didn't like to play it. He was tired of those old records, and there were very few of the recordings that had been million sellers that he played in his later years, and he really struggled with that.
You're listening to the voice of Chuck Pardue. This is a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez, and we're talking to Chuck today because he has just put out a really interesting book called Harry James, Trumpet Icon, the book that you need to read if you like the music and the personality of that iconic trumpeter, Harry James. Now, I want to talk about the book for sure. I'd like to know, Chuck, how and why did this project of writing the book come about? How did you carry out the research for this book? Did you find any sort of difficulties along the way? Tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, you know, it's funny because I tell people that this book is nearly 60 years in the making. When I was 8 and 9 years old, I was what they now call a gifted student in school. And I was writing articles in national publications and had gotten awards at the age of 9. And in fact, I even wrote for Downbeat magazine when I was 15 years old. And I always wanted to be a journalist. And so even when I was trying to play the piano and the drums, my natural bent was toward writing things. And then once I started playing the trumpet, I quit writing. And so over the period of the last 30 some years, ever since Harry died in 1983, people kept telling me, you know what, Chuck, nobody knows as much about Harry James as you. You ought to write a book. And I really never entertained the idea of doing that. And then about 20 years ago, a man named Peter Levinson wrote a book called Trumpet Blues. And Trumpet Blues was a biography of Harry's life. And it really was, it took a bent toward a National Enquirer type of an approach. It was just every horrible thing that he could find about Harry James' life, he put into this book. And he really didn't go into dealing with the music whatsoever. And the thought had occurred to me that, the general public didn't know anything about Harry's personal life. All they knew about was his trumpet playing. And so last year, my friend Brian Byers and I, we had gone out to dinner with our wives, and we were just talking, and he said, I was looking for a way to further my musical career because I was trying to get more club dates. I wanted to do some jazz clinics and that kind of thing, and I'm trying to get a foot in the door. And he said, you ought to write an article about Harry James and submit it to some of the jazz education periodicals. And maybe you'll get some work doing lectures and clinics and stuff. And so I sat down one day on December the 6th of last year, and I started to write an article. And the more I got into the article, the more I realized this needs to be a book. And I couldn't stop, Anton. I literally couldn't. And you could ask Cheryl. She'll tell you, I would be doing something, and all of a sudden I'd run to the computer because something had popped into my head. And I had taken a notebook and written all the notes of the things that I wanted to cover in the book. And as I would cover it in the book, I crossed it out. And it were pages and pages of names and places that I wanted to include in the book. And so it became an obsession for me for about 6 months. Mm-hmm. And so I had approached some publishers, and they had some interest, but each one of them, for various reasons, rejected it. So everybody that I know in my world just said, Chuck, just self-publish it on Amazon, and it'll get some attention. And indeed it has. But the book is about the musical career of Harry James. Mm-hmm. It doesn't deal with his marriages or any of his vices or any of the negative stuff. It's just about music. And that's what people wanted to know. I even had Harry James Jr., who has become a very dear friend of mine. When he read the rough draft, he said, Chuck, he said, people have been trying to get me to endorse books and endorse stuff because of my name for all these years. And he says, I want to be a part of your book. And he wrote the foreword to the book because he said, you've answered questions about my dad that I've asked for years in the book.
Well, that definitely really is what you want. That's definitely what you want in a book like this.
Yes, everybody that's read it, and I every 2 hours my phone will ding, and it'll be somebody that bought the book and has read it, and they're telling me what they think, and all of them are telling me, this is just his music. This is what we wanted to know. These are the things we've cared about and wondered about all these years. And so I feel gratified. I'm satisfied right now if I never sell another copy that I did what I set out to do.
Well, I appreciate that kind of an approach because as a music fan, that's what I am interested in. The life is interesting to me when it comes to a musician or an author or, somebody famous even. The life is important in my view as much as it intersects with the work because, if I want to read about Frank Sinatra, I don't need to read too much, if anything, about his possible mafia connections or the scandals of his personal life, because what I'm interested in is his Columbia records and his Capitol records and his Reprise records. And by the same token, with Harry James, what I'm interested in is his music. So whenever I find books about musicians that I like, it is because those books talk about the music of the musicians, which is why I'm interested in these people. And, I have gone so far as to throw books in the trash because they don't talk about the music and they dwell on scandalous issues that I'm not interested in. Now, having said that, I want to thank you for taking that approach. And I'm wondering, how hard it was for you to carry out the necessary research to write an in-depth book like this?
Well, I should have said earlier that one of the things that I had noticed all through my life is that every time I would go to a library and or to a bookstore, even to when I go to Powell's Books in downtown Portland, and I look through the jazz books, and I look to see if there's any references to Harry James, and there's so few references to him in the annals of jazz writing. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was commercially successful. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the jazz musicians who, to be honest, jazz musicians are very rarely financially successful. You know, jazz musicians like myself, we beat our brains out, for $100 a night for our whole life, and we never consider ourselves to be successful. And here along comes this skinny trumpet player from Texas that makes $25 million. And so the jazz community said, he's sold out. Mm-hmm. And so there's not much been written about Harry. So the research that I have undertaken, I started undertaking 52 years ago. And I have one of those brains that when I learn something, it has a tendency to get filed away, and I keep it for future reference. And so when I began to write this book, if I needed to answer a particular question, and there weren't too many questions that I couldn't answer by myself, but I knew where to go get the information because I'd seen it before. Mm-hmm. And now with the internet, it makes that kind of research so much easier. You can actually see pages of books and magazines. I found magazine articles where Harry had been interviewed in 1938 and 1940, mm-hmm. and all through the 50s. And so those things I was able to reference because I knew where to find them. If you were to try to write my book today, you would not know where to begin to find the information, mm-hmm. because it's so hidden. It's so hidden. But because I'm a jazz musician, I know the history of the periodicals. I knew about Metronome Magazine and Downbeat Magazine and Bandleaders Magazine. I knew about Harry having interviews in Life Magazine and Saturday Evening Post and all those different things over the years. And so those have become part of the storehouse of knowledge that I've almost an obsession about Harry James that I've kept in my head all these years.
Now, besides knowing where to look and knowing where the sources were and being familiar with the sources, how much did it help you in the course of writing this book? The fact that you are a jazz musician yourself.
Well, I think that's probably, and some friends of mine have told me, that's part of the reason why Mr. Levinson wrote the book that he did. Of course, he wanted to have a book that would sell a lot of copies. And so the sensationalism was there, but he was not a musician. And to write a book like the book I've written, you almost would have to be a musician. Mm-hmm. I don't know how anybody that's not a musician would write the book I wrote, because I deal with technical issues about the differences between mouthpieces and the differences between the bore size of the trumpet and all of those different things, and about arranging skills and adding a baritone sax or a fifth trumpet to a band, what it does to change the sound. Those are all things only an experienced musician would know.
How did you make sure that you wrote the book in such a way that it would be interesting to people who are not trained in music?
Well, another thing that my wife and Harry James Jr. and different people that have read different portions of the book, they've told me that my writing style, I didn't know I had a writing style, Anton. My writing style is conversational. People that have read the book, or people that have read snippets of the book, have said, it makes me feel when I read it like I'm sitting across a coffee table from you and you're telling me the story. Mm-hmm. And really, the most successful writers and authors are people that are storytellers. Mm-hmm. And if you can tell the story, make it interesting, and add the musical information and all of those things into it, people are telling me that it's a captivating read. Of course, the vast majority of the people that are telling me are musicians.
Mhm.
But I'm also having people, ladies, for example, that have read the book that are not musicians, but they love the music. Have said this is just a fascinating read. I had a guy tell me that he got the book last night and he stayed up all night. He couldn't lay it down because every page he got a question answered that he'd been asking for a long time.
Well, that is wonderful to know about the book because, there are many questions that over the years I've had, and I still have about Harry James. And, reading the book, you can get the answers to those questions, and maybe to some that you didn't even know you had. And I think the interesting thing, since you're mentioning that your writing style is conversational. For many years, I have read the Bing Crosby autobiography, Call Me Lucky, from 1953. And that book was not really written by Bing Crosby, but it came out of several conversations that Bing Crosby had with Pete Martin, who actually wrote the book. But Pete Martin was such a skilled writer that when you read the book, it really sounds and it really reads like you are talking to Bing Crosby himself. And I think that is absolutely, extremely difficult to achieve.
Well, and another aspect of my book that really sets it apart, Anton, is this. And is I couldn't have written this book 30 years ago. I just couldn't have. I mean, I had the information in my head, but the way that I wrote the book and the people that have been involved in helping me with stories, I didn't know them. I didn't have access to them 30 years ago. And when I met my wife, it's a funny story. I go into it in the book, but the first time I saw Cheryl Morris is my wife's stage name. It was 40 years ago. She was the new girl singer with Harry James. And I had gone to see Harry a couple of nights in St. Louis. And at one point, I stood about 6 feet from her. But at the time, I was married and had my first daughter on the way. And so all I wanted to do was hang out with my hero. And so I never got to meet Cheryl. But then about 30 years later, we kind of stumbled across one another on a Facebook Harry James group. And I sent her an email and I said, hey, I remember you. And I told her where I had seen her sing. And once she had determined that I wasn't a stalker, she gave me her phone number. We started talking on the phone. I was in Ohio and she was in Portland, Oregon. And so long story short, after talking on the phone for 6 months, I came here for a vacation in Portland. And 5 days later, we were engaged. And 6 weeks later, we got married. And I say all that to say that she's given me access to all those great musicians because she was on the band for 10 years and she's friends with all of the remaining sidemen who are still living with the Harry James Band. And so when they got wind of the fact that I was writing this book, they all jumped at the chance to be a part. And so I got fabulous stories from many of these guys about Harry that I had no way of knowing. Different performances that he had given, that they were on the band, and they told me the story of that night. And so that's really what has made this book so unique.
So in a way, the book has an oral history sort of component to it as well.
Absolutely. There's a part of the book where I've sent a questionnaire out to a bunch of musicians that had been part of Harry's band, and then they answered the questions and added stories, and then some of them we communicated further and added more stories. And so it really is an oral history of the Harry James Orchestra, beginning with Harry playing the drums at the age of 4 in the circus band.
The book is called Harry James, Trumpet Icon, and the author is Chuck Pardue, and you're listening to him loud and clear coming from Portland, Oregon. My name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez, and this is a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast that you'll be able to listen to on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. There is a personal connection with Harry James through your wife, who sang with the band. But what about your personal relationship with Harry James? How many times did you get to spend time with him? What was it like?
Well, I have a section of the book called Harry and Me, and it details the way that I met him, and it details all the times over the 13 years that we were friends that I got to spend time with him. To give just a short version of it, as I mentioned earlier, my dad was dying of cancer in 1969. He passed away in September of 69. And when he was in the Veterans Hospital, basically on the terminal ward, they didn't know how much time he had. And every day, after school, I'd pick up my three brothers and my mom. We'd drive to the Veterans Hospital, and we would spend the evening with my dad in the terminal ward. And I'd do my homework in the hospital. So one day, I had read the newspaper, and there was a headline that said, Harry James coming to Miami. And he had not been to Miami since 1943. And this was 1969. And so I was just excited beyond myself. And so I went up to my dad's hospital room, and I showed it to my dad. And my dad, I could tell that he didn't take it well, because he's thinking like a father. And he's wanting to find a way to get me to meet Harry James. And so what I didn't know, the short story is, I had forgotten about it. And I got a phone call in January of 1970 from a man who was the CEO of a country club in Miami, Florida, where we lived. And my father had called his friend that was the editor of the Miami Herald and said, look, I'm not going to be here in January. They don't know how much time I have, but is there any way my kid can get to meet Harry James? And so on January the 30th, 1970, my mother got me a new suit at JCPenney's, and a chauffeured limousine picked me up at the front door and took me to the Miami Springs villas to go meet Harry James. And the guy took me into where Harry was at the bar, and his trumpet was laying on a red velour pillow with his initials engraved in gold on the pillow. And so the guy says, Harry, this is Chuck Pardue. And Harry stuck out his hand and he said, Chuck, it's nice to meet you. I've heard a lot about you. And I later found out that he'd heard a lot about me through his secretary, Viola Monti, who became a dear friend. She just passed away last month. She was a dear friend. And so every time Harry was going to be anywhere near where I lived, she would send me an itinerary and tickets to go see Harry and the band. But that first night was magical. As a 16-year-old boy, to be able to spend an evening sitting with Harry at his private table and watching the band. And it's still emboldened in my memory.
You know, Harry.
And so all through those years then, of course, I got older. I wasn't 16, then I'm 18, then I'm 19. And all through those years, we had a relationship to where whenever he was performing and I was there, he'd take me back in his dressing room and we'd hang out. And I'd ask my stupid questions and he'd do his best to answer them. And he provided me with trumpets and music and mouthpieces. And, it was just a really magical friendship I had with Harry James.
You know, from the point of view of somebody that knows his records, like myself, and who has read about him and seen him on TV and seen him play and listened to him play, but unfortunately never met him. It always feels like Harry James was just a really elegant kind of gentleman. So somebody that I always say that he is one of those people like Tony Bennett, for example, that I find really interesting, and I would love to spend an afternoon just chatting with them. Am I wrong in that perception of Harry James from your point of view?
He was. Here's the thing about Harry is I've mentioned that I think that music is in the DNA, and I also believe that there's what I like to call an entertainer gene. That is a person that is a showman, and they're born that way. And Harry James was brought up in the circus and then all the success of Benny Goodman, but he was a showman. And part of being a good showman is to carry yourself in a professional way. And so he always gave the impression of being an elegant gentleman whenever people saw him. In his motion, in the way he talked, and just his mannerisms, he was a classy guy. That was his public persona. When you're hanging out with him, it might not have been quite the same. But that was what he showed to his public, and that's why they never lost interest in him till the very day that he died.
Now, Harry James, throughout the years, especially in the late 30s and early 40s, he hired some excellent singers. And in fact, I said before that the Carnegie Hall concert was the first time I ever heard Harry James. But then there were the recordings that he made with Frank Sinatra in 1939, All or Nothing at All, and It's Funny to Everyone But Me, and Melancholy Mood, and even some of those air checks that still survive. But then he also had Dave Hames, and he had Helen Forrest, among a host of others. What was the role of singers within a big band, and why were singers important to the business?
Well, from the very beginning of the big band era, I mean, officially it began in 1935 with Benny Goodman. But the singer was a necessity because you had people that were interested in the music, but then you had the Bobby Soxers, the teenage girls who were interested in the lyrics of the songs. And so every band had to have a boy singer and a girl singer. And the thing that set Harry apart, and my wife and I were talking about this yesterday, is the fact that Harry never was oppressive to his musicians. Harry wanted to share his success with the people that helped make him successful. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of band leaders that weren't that way. They wanted all the limelight. Benny Goodman, for example, Benny Goodman was all about Benny Goodman. Mm-hmm. And Artie Shaw was all about Artie Shaw. I mean, I had the privilege, I guess to say a privilege, to work with Benny Goodman one time. And it was as if we were irrelevant. But with Harry, he knew that he needed his band to support him. And whoever was part of Harry's band, he treated them like family. And so the singers were the same way. When he would come up with an arrangement for Helen Forrest or Kitty Callan, he wanted the arrangement to be built around their singing, mm-hmm. as opposed to just his trumpet. In those days, the singers would get up, they'd sing a chorus, and they'd go back and sit down. And when Helen Forrest started singing with Harry James, he would have the entire arrangement built around Helen's solo, her vocal. In fact, she might even come back and sing another vocal before the song is over. Mm-hmm. That was unheard of with big bands. The big bands looked at the girl singer as an appendage, as a necessary evil. But Harry was the one that wanted to share the wealth. That's how he used to say. He'd say, "I want to share the wealth. I want to give you a little taste of my success." And that's the way he was with people that worked with him.
Well, that definitely is the case on recordings like, with Helen Forrest. And, some of them, like I Don't Want to Walk Without You, you get to hear a lot of the singer on that record, whereas on a lot of other recordings, it was music, vocal chorus, and then music to carry out the recording. Right. I've always found that it was very interesting how, as the big band years and the big band era progressed, the focus became more and more on the singer. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, in late 1942, the Musicians Union, who was at the time their president was a man named James Caesar Petrillo. Mm-hmm. And he had decided that he thought the musicians, and really, he was right, the musicians needed to get a bigger cut of the recording pie. And so as a result, he led the Musicians Union on an 18-month strike where musicians were not allowed to record. Instrumentalists were not allowed to record on records. And so what happened was the singers became the focal point of the record companies. They did two things. They either went back and found old recordings and reissued them, All or Nothing at All being a prime example. Mm-hmm. When All or Nothing at All came out in November of 1939, it only sold 8,000 copies. But in 1943, when Columbia reissued it and changed the label, instead of saying All or Nothing at All, Harry James and his orchestra, vocal refrain by Frank Sinatra, it said All or Nothing at All, Frank Sinatra, orchestral accompaniment by Harry James. Mm-hmm. And when the record came out, it was a million seller. And then the other thing that happened was the singers began to be featured on the recordings, and there's no backup musicians. So you had literally vocal choirs backing up Dick Haynes and Frank Sinatra and Joe Stafford. And the vocalists provided the accompaniment with the oohs and ahs and the doo-doos and all the stuff behind the vocal. And so by the time the musicians in 1944 were able to go back into the studio, they didn't care about the musicians anymore. They wanted to know who the singer was. And that really is what killed the big band era, as we call it.
Now, that happened after World War II, when the big band business began to decline for that reason that you're talking about, and I'm sure several others. One of them, which I always found very interesting, is this article by Gene Lees called Pavilion in the Rain, where he talks about how the demise of the big bands was connected with the dismantlement of the railway system. In the sense that it became a lot more expensive to travel because it wasn't possible to use the train system anymore as a way to get to the different dates. But one of the things that I've always found interesting about the big band business was the fact that these bands were doing so many one-nighters, and they were appearing all over the country, and they were playing the same songs together every night on the bandstand. I suppose that by the time they got to the recording studio to make the records, they knew the songs so well that they probably didn't need to play them too many times.
Well, that's true to an extent. Harry was a little different than many of the other bands because by the mid to late 40s, he had become established in venues where he was able to stay for longer periods of time. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like they were just doing one-nighters all the time. But yeah, it was quite grueling on musicians. Their health suffered, the diets suffered. Their minds suffered because they're playing the same things night after night after night. And so I wasn't around in those days, but I did plenty of one-nighters with big bands in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. And it was not a lifestyle that I don't think I would have selected if that would have been my career path, because it's very tough. And of course, it affects relationships and all of those things. You go out on the road for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months at a time sometimes. Harry was very fortunate. By the late 40s, he'd begun to be established in the Click Ballroom in Philadelphia and the Astor Hotel in New York City, the Hollywood Palladium in California. So he had, and then Vegas came along in 1958. So he had places where the musicians could actually have a life and still work at night.
Yeah, I did want to go into that part of his career because, I find that for most big bands, the late 1940s spelled, the end of their existence and the end of a whole era, as we now know, the swing era, the big band years. How did this decline in the business and this change in the music business affect Harry James, and what were his opinions regarding, the change that the music business was undergoing in the late 40s and the early 50s, and then, of course, with the onslaught of rock and roll in the 1950s? Right.
Well, by the time 1940s, and as you referred to, 1946 was the collapse of the big band era. I mean, most of the major band leaders closed up shop for several months. Some of them never came back. Some of them had, periodically they'd bring a band out and just for special occasions. But Harry was one of the handful of band leaders that remained all the way through into the 80s. Mm-hmm. And, but he had become financially successful by the late 40s to the point to where he didn't have to work as much. And so if you don't have to work as much, then it changes your attitude toward your performing. It doesn't become as grueling and taxing on you. You don't dread it. because you say, hey, we're going to go into the Palladium for 2 weeks, and y'all can go home after the gig and go play golf the next day, and then come out and do the gig. And so it changed his approach to what he was doing. As far as the changes in music, Harry was one of the bands that continued to try to keep up with the music to some extent. All through the 50s, he was covering all the hit tunes. If Teresa Brewer came out and sang Till I Waltz Again With You, then it was for sure that you'd hear Harry play Till I Waltz Again With You on a dance date. He tried to cover the popular songs of the day. He did that all the way through the 60s and even into the early 70s. The first time I saw Harry perform, he was playing tunes by Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Sly and the Family Stone. He always tried to stay musically current as best he could within the confines of a 16-piece band. And a lot of the bands didn't want to do that. Stan Kenton wouldn't do that. Count Basie really never did that, but Harry did it. And it kept him as a viable, marketable product all the way up until his last sold-out date in 1983.
Why do you think he did that? Why was he interested in the new music? Or is it just that was all that he knew how to do or wanted to do? What's the reason that despite all the changes, and the changes were not just musical, they were also social, historical, cultural. Yeah. Why did he keep it up?
Well, I cover that in the book, but he tried to keep abreast of the culture. For example, most folks don't realize that when Blood, Sweat, and Tears first came out, and Al Cooper, they weren't a commercially successful band. But Harry had heard them, and Harry fought to get Blood, Sweat, and Tears to open for him in Vegas. And the very first gigs that Blood, Sweat, and Tears ever got in Las Vegas were because of Harry James. And even the last time I saw Lou Soloff, he's gone now, but he mentioned if it wasn't for Harry James, none of us would have a gig. And so that's the kind of guy Harry was. And if he had somebody that he, like a Frank Sinatra or a Helen Forrest, that he had as a singer with his band, he wanted to make sure they were successful on their own. And so Harry just had within him this desire to continue to entertain people. It's part of that being a showman that I mentioned earlier. He had to perform. I understand it because I'm somewhat like that. I have this skill that most folks don't have, and I know there's people that get happiness derived from what I do, and so I continue to do it. And so that's what Harry was. He hated being a nostalgia act, and that's why he tried to keep the music current. But he knew that his place in the American culture was as a band leader, and so he never gave it up.
In your book, you talk quite a bit about Harry James's relationship with Frank Sinatra, and of course that's an unavoidable subject when one talks about Harry James. And as I said before, one of the first times I ever heard him was because of those recordings that he made with Frank Sinatra as the vocalist. The star, of course, would have been Harry James. The name on the label would have been Harry James's name, but Sinatra was the boy singer in the orchestra. One thing I've always found really interesting about Harry James was how generous he was to Sinatra when Tommy Dorsey wanted to hire him away from the band.
Right. And, it's a running joke. I have a recording. It's a private recording that is from 1969 from Caesar's Palace. And Harry James is the band, and Frank Sinatra is the star. And Harry's band in 69 accompanies Frank Sinatra. But you can hear the banter between the two. That Frank always called him boss. And Frank always told Harry all through those years, if you ever need me, give me a call. And in fact, at Harry James's memorial service, Frank Sinatra gave the eulogy. And they remained friends, and Frank Sinatra realized that he owed his career to a large extent to Harry James.
Is there any specific reason why they didn't record together very much after Sinatra left the band in 1939?
Well, I think probably if you look through the 40s, for example, there were not a lot of pairings of musical stars other than the Andrews Sisters and Bing Crosby or, something like that. But generally, you didn't mix stars on the same record. And really, that was something that was created by Mitch Miller in the early days when he was the A&R producer for Columbia Records. He thought that he could take the famous names from the 40s, in many cases, and match them up with an up-and-coming singer, or put people together on a record and would double the chance of it becoming successful. And for Mitch Miller, it worked more often than not. But I think that Sinatra grew as an entertainer, and so he would go a period of time requiring this type of accompaniment, this type, and then he will change and he'll want this type of accompaniment. He would go from having Nelson Riddle and 35 musicians to Count Basie with 18 musicians and 4 strings. It just depended on where his mood was, and he would change. And so Harry went his own direction and Frank went his direction, and there wasn't much opportunity for them to be together, although, especially through the late 60s and 70s, they did work together in Vegas quite a bit.
Yeah, I always think about that because, Sinatra did record albums with Basie, with Duke Ellington, with the Thundering Herd of Woody Herman in the 70s. And I've always wished that somehow the stars had aligned at some point, and Sinatra and James could have recorded together in the 60s for Reprise or something like that. Now, they did record for Columbia a couple of tunes in the 40s, and unfortunately, the spark, for whatever reason, and I think the reason, wasn't there.
All right. It was 1951, and the reason that the spark wasn't there is because Frank Sinatra was in New York and Harry James was in Los Angeles. And so Harry went in the band and they recorded their music, and then Frank dubbed his vocal on top of the music months later. And so they weren't able to interact, and the material wasn't particularly good. But, there again, Frank Sinatra, by that time, Frank Sinatra was the star, and there wasn't room for another star on his record. And when you think of Count Basie and his orchestra, you think of a large ensemble that plays as an ensemble. But when you think of Harry James, you think of a trumpet. And so there wasn't much for Harry to do in a Frank Sinatra concert.
I understand. And, the other day when we were talking on the phone about, the interview and the conversation we were going to have today, we did mention something that, had been on my mind for a long time. As a music fan, but somebody who does not know music really, technically or, from a formal perspective, I always think of the careers of musicians as, opportunities that could have actually happened and never happened, which is, too bad that it didn't happen. So to give you an example, the fact that Sinatra, for example, never recorded an album with just piano, with just Bill Miller on piano, for example, that's an example of that. Sinatra not recording with Harry James is another example of that. And I've always wondered why it is that Harry James, being a jazz trumpeter and really steeped in jazz and knowing the idiom so well, why is it that Harry James didn't record very often in a small group jazz setting?
And that's something I cover in the book. Over the years, he did record some sides with a small group. And in 1946, for example, he recorded Pagan Love Song, Tuxedo Junction, You'll Never Know, and Cottontail with a small band. And then in the middle 50s, when Harry, I call it the semi-retirement phase, when he began to book a 9-piece band. And they actually appeared on the Milton Berle show with Elvis Presley with a 9-piece band with Harry James. But he had become so identified as a big band leader that he didn't feel comfortable outside of that setting. I mention in the book that in the mid-70s, Norman Granz, who had Verve Records and then Pablo, had approached Harry several times about Harry recording with some other trumpet players like Dizzy Gillespie and Clark Terry and Roy Eldridge in a small group with Oscar Peterson, and Harry just totally refused every time. And I think it had gotten to the point where his self-worth as a human probably was as a big band leader.
That makes a lot of sense, and it really is too bad for the enjoyment of music lovers like yourself or myself that he never did that, especially because I find that those pairings that Norman Granz was doing from the 1950s on to the 1970s and 80s and beyond, they're really rewarding musically. And, if they hadn't been preserved on record by Norman Granz, they never would have been preserved on record.
Right. Yeah, I was watching last night. In fact, I shared it on my Facebook page. I watched a Norman Granz production from 1979 of Count Basie, the Count Basie sextet or septet or whatever, and it was Count Basie with a rhythm section and Zoot Sims and Roy Eldridge. And Roy Eldridge was 68 years old at that concert. And the fire that was created, the electricity that was created by those musicians live in concert, Verve and Pablo came pretty close to capturing that on record. There's something that happens to jazz musicians in a live concert setting that it's almost like lightning in a bottle. Somebody better record this because it's not going to come around again. And I got to witness some of those nights with Harry. I saw him do some things in concerts and especially in dance gigs where he'd be playing for dancers, and all of a sudden he'd pull up some tune that the band hadn't seen in 15 years and just do the most amazing musical things with that trumpet. And it's like, I wish I had a copy of that tape, and I can still remember those nights when he just was on fire, and I'm fortunate that Harry always let me record him, even though his management wasn't happy. He'd always let me take a cheap tape recorder and record the concert. And some of those from the early 70s I even have one of his last two performances where I'm so glad that I still have that preserved because it was magical.
Now, Chuck, you have been preserving the music and the memory of Harry James for a while now, not just by means of this book that I recommend to everybody listening out there, Harry James, Trumpet Icon. But there's other ways in which you keep his music alive, isn't that right?
Yeah, and I'm very grateful that God's blessed me to where at this point in my life at 66, I still play pretty good trumpet, and I added vocals back in the 80s, and now what I do is much of what I've done over the last few years is to entertain folks at retirement communities and assisted living communities. And I don't like to use the term nursing home, but occasionally a place that people would call a nursing home. And to go in and recreate for them the music of their childhood and their youth and do it in an authentic way that they recognize the music and appreciate it. And I get paid to do it. And so I just recently had a situation where I got national recognition because I played my trumpet in the courtyard of a retirement community because the residents couldn't leave their apartments. So they all came out on their balconies and I serenaded them with my trumpet. And I enjoyed doing that. And that's the little career I've had over the last few years.
And there's a video on YouTube that actually chronicles that, a news piece from some local TV channel I was watching the other night, and it just sounded really good. And I'm sure a lot of those people in the audience appreciate that because, unfortunately, Chuck, that's the kind of music that we don't get to hear much anymore. There was a time in this country many, many years ago where jazz was the popular music of the day. You turn on the maybe the television, but for sure the radio, and there it was. But that time is long gone, and I've always been a believer in the fact that maybe one of the reasons why this kind of music is not as well known and not as popular these days is because it's just not very easy to access, despite the internet and social media.
Right, and that's true. And as you mentioned earlier, when we were referencing the '40s and the demise of the great band era, a major reason not only was transportation and the railways, as you said, but it was also the cost.
Mm-hmm.
As the musicians' wages went up, it began to become more expensive to hire a big band, and so to the point now where it's almost impossible to put 15 or 16 musicians on the stage and have them perform and them to make a fair wage and the people be able to afford the tickets. Mm-hmm. And, the surveys have said over the last couple of years that jazz is now the least popular musical genre in America. And a lot of that I blame on the educational system because they haven't kept it in the educational system. When I was in high school, we had music appreciation class. And we studied the history of jazz in school. And you don't get that anymore. And so now you have to seek it out, Anton. If you don't look for it, you're never going to find it. And so I'm just fortunate that I can still do it on some scale. And Cheryl and I have, over the last few years, we've put together a big band and gone and performed somewhere. And there are musicians, I know some young musicians that I've influenced that are now beginning to play this music. And it's never going to come back, but as long as we're around, it's going to hang in there. If you look for it, it's still going to be there.
It's a situation, though, that has been going on for a long time because even, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of musicians, jazz musicians, especially African-American musicians, but not only, they would move to Europe because their music was better accepted over there than it was here, and they could find work and they could make a fairly decent living playing their music over in Europe and in other parts of the world, and not necessarily in the land that saw this music come to fruition.
Right, and I've talked to some of the members of Harry's band, and they've told me about the tours that they did in Europe and in Japan. And in the 70s and early 80s, Harry began to go every year to South America, to Brazil. Mm-hmm. And they were much more accepted there by the people in fact, when they would go to Japan or England, for example, those people knew that music. Mm-hmm. They knew who the guys in the band were. They knew that was Corky Corcoran playing tenor sax. Some of the guys told me that they literally worshipped Harry James and Buddy Rich when they came to Japan and to Europe. I mean, they treated them like they were gods. And in America, the cultural winds are so fickle. By the time 1952 came around, Bill Haley and the Comets, 5 or 6 musicians could have a $1 million record. You didn't need to pay for all the backup musicians anymore. Mm-hmm. Because, the young people, they're satisfied with that. And so I often say that the dumbing down of America began with the music in the 50s.
Well, more importantly, I think it was not the musicians themselves anymore that were making all the musical decisions. And that also becomes a problem because when you think of people like Artie Shaw or, Count Basie or Tommy Dorsey, Harry James, these were outstanding musicians that had a sense of what would be commercial. They would make the calls. They would decide what songs they wanted to record. But over time, they kind of lost that kind of control, and it became the job of the AR man and then the accountants, and so it got to the point, and Donald Clark talks about this really clearly in his book about Sinatra, All or Nothing at All, A Life of Frank Sinatra, how it got to the point where the musicians were not making those decisions anymore. It was the accountants who were trying to make decisions based on what would sell, but with little to no musical knowledge. So, it is a multifaceted reason why this has been happening over the decades, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And, I'm also an aficionado of Frank Sinatra. I've done a lot of studying of him because I'm a singer. And, of course, if you're a singer and you sing popular music, you got to know who Frank Sinatra is. And my friend Bryant Byers worked a lot with Frank Sinatra Jr. And the stories I've heard of somebody convincing Frank that he needed to sing a particular song. And so he would have the arrangement written. They would go in and they would rehearse it. And some of the guys that had worked with Frank for a long time, because he kept the same guys year after year after year, said, "Frank, what the heck are we doing this song for?" And, there was a famous story, Irv Cotler was Frank's drummer for many years, that they had begun to do a disco version of Night and Day.
Oh, it's a business.
And All or Nothing at All. And in the late 70s, when Frank would come on stage, they would open with this disco version that Joe Beck wrote the arrangement of. They would have smoke machines and lights, and Frank would come out of the smoke and sing this disco version of Night and Day. And one night they were having a rehearsal, and Irv Cotler said to Frank, he said, "Frank, what are we singing this for? What are we doing this for?" And Frank looked at the music and said, "You're right." And he ordered the musicians to throw the music on the floor.
Absolutely.
Because it was not something that they needed to be doing. So if you were Harry James or Frank Sinatra and were fortunate enough to have that stature, you could still call your own shots. But most of the rest of the musicians were just hirelings, and they had really no influence over what happened with their own careers, at least from the professional standpoint of it.
And in the case of Sinatra, he always wanted to keep abreast of the times and still have hits in the 60s and 70s, whereas, other singers from his generation and before, like, Bing Crosby, for example, he wasn't as interested in having hits anymore. And that's why he started making the kind of records he wanted to make, because it didn't matter to him anymore whether, the records were going to be climbing up the charts or not. They just wanted to make, good albums. And that's the time when Bing Crosby began freelancing instead of, having a recording contract. I always find it interesting that Sinatra wanted to have his own record label to call the shots. And after a while, he quit calling the shots. So it's a little bit surprising.
There's a lot of similarities to what Frank Sinatra and Harry James both were going through during the 60s and early 70s. Mm-hmm. Both of them had enough hit recordings, especially Harry. People don't realize, because everybody talks about Glenn Miller. Harry James was the most commercially successful big band of the entire big band era. Harry James had 73 songs hit the Billboard charts between 1939 and 1955. I mean, that's unheard of. Mm-hmm. Harry James stayed on the charts, but they both had enough hit records that they wanted another taste of success. And it was especially frustrating for Harry, because in the mid 60s, Al Hirt and Herb Alpert were selling all these records. And Harry looked at the music that they were playing and thought it was low quality music in many examples. Harry said, "How come these guys have hits and I can't get a hit record?" And that was what really led him to what I call the Dot experiment, where he signed a contract with Dot Records, and Dot picked all the music for him. And he recorded some stuff that he ordinarily would never have recorded because he wanted to try to have a hit record. Mm-hmm. And so that's a frustrating thing to have been, it's like an aging slugger on a baseball team. You used to be able to hit the ball 475 feet, and then you get to be 36 years old and you still know you can still do that, but the situation has to be absolutely perfect for you to recreate it.
You're listening to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. Chuck Pardue is coming loud and clear over the telephone from Portland, Oregon, and he is the author of this new book about Harry James that you really need to track down and read. It's called Harry James, Trumpet Icon. And if you like the music of Harry James, if you are a jazz fan, you need to read this book. As we're winding down the conversation, we've been talking for about, a better part of 75 minutes now, Chuck, and it's really a pleasure chatting with you, sharing in your knowledge about music and jazz and swing and Harry James. I want to give you the chance to just talk briefly about what people will find in your book. If they, of course, haven't read it already, present the book to the audience out there. What will they find if they pick up a copy of Harry James' Trumpet Icon and they read that very interesting book?
Well, when I made the decision, and let me say again, Anton, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of your broadcast and to share this, because this is, as you can tell, I'm sure, is a personal passion for me and has been for most of my adult life.
Well, we share that passion.
When I made, yeah, I know we do. We talked the other day. We could have had an interview out of the last phone call. But I made the decision to self-publish on Amazon, knowing that I wouldn't sell as many books and it wouldn't get the marketing. But I wanted to make an affordable book that not only fans of big band music and people that might have been fans of Harry James himself, but also musicians. And it's amazing how we musicians have a hunger and a thirst for knowledge about things that we were too busy performing to take note of. Mm-hmm. I was so busy in the 70s and 80s as a working musician that I missed a lot of things, that I had to go back, not just with Harry James, but music in general, and go back and pick up some pieces that I'd left. Frank Sinatra recorded an album called Songs That I Missed.
Absolutely.
Some songs that I missed. And that's something that's been gratifying for me, is that musicians and guys that even no longer play, but were working musicians in the 50s and 60s and 70s, would want to pick this book up, and they're going to go, yeah, that's exactly right. Oh, I remember that kind of a gig. Or, some of the stories that are in the book that are going to elicit emotion from people. There's a story in the book that a friend of mine, Tony Scodwell, told me. Tony was the lead trumpet player for Harry from about 1964 until 68. And he had been the lead trumpet player for Stan Kenton, and then he went and became a successful lead trumpet player in Las Vegas after he left Harry. But he told me a couple of stories. There was one story about Harry on the Ed Sullivan Show. And this is going to be the first time anybody hears that story of that performance, of when Harry performed with Robert Goulet on an Irving Berlin tribute in 1968 on the Ed Sullivan Show. But I get to tell the backstage story of what was going on that television show, and it's really interesting to read that story, because as a TV fan or a music fan, you see something, you go, man, that must have been a gas to be a part of that. Well, now I've told stories about what was really going on backstage, and it's worth reading. It really is.
Remind the people how they can get the book, and tell them also a little bit about your YouTube channel.
Well, the book is called Harry James Trumpet Icon. And if you go to Amazon and type in Harry James and click on the book category, right now it comes up first. Or you can type in Harry James Trumpet Icon, and it's selling very affordably in paperback on Amazon. My YouTube channel, I have my own YouTube channel, and it's Old Brown Eyes, OLBRNEYES, because Old Blue Eyes was taken. Old Brown Eyes is my channel. You just type in, if you type in Harry James into YouTube, chances are that one of my almost 600 videos is going to pop up and you'll see my name. And I'm gratified that I have over 4,000 worldwide subscribers to my YouTube channel. And there's music on there that you can't find anywhere else on planet Earth, but it's on my YouTube channel, and it's worth seeking out.
And the number of subscribers definitely proves what we were talking about before. There is still interest in this kind of music out there.
And what's really fun for me as a musician and a Harry James fan and now an author is I'll post something, I'll find a TV recording or I'll find a concert recording that nobody's heard in 50 years. And it'll feature a particular musician, like Ray Sims on trombone or Corky Corcoran on tenor sax. And I'll get an email from the children or grandchildren of those musicians that are long gone. And they'll tell me how much they appreciate me putting that up on YouTube because they'd never heard their grandfather play that. And the same thing has happened with the Harry James book and the Harry James Music Appreciation Group on Facebook. We have almost 2,500 members now. And I have Harry's grandchildren and children. Harry James Jr. is one of my friends, and his nieces and nephews. They'll say, "We never got to meet our grandpa," or "We never got to meet Uncle Harry," and we're so glad you share these stories about him. It helps us know who he was.
I can understand what you're talking about, because years ago in the mid-2000s, I hosted a classic country music and old jazz show on the now defunct station WRVU in Nashville, Tennessee, where I went to graduate school, and I would play a record, and people would once in a while call the station and say, "Hey, it's my grandfather playing fiddle on that record." I remember playing the Marion Morgan version of White Christmas, and I told you about this the other day, with Harry James and the orchestra, and somebody called saying that they were related to Marion Morgan. So, there are people out there who are interested in this kind of music, is the bottom line, and it's wonderful that people like you, Chuck, are keeping up the memory and keeping the legacy alive for people like Harry James and all the great big bands from the 1930s, 40s, and beyond. And so I know this last question, because, I could keep talking to you for 2, 3, 4 hours about Harry James. But at some point, we're going to have to put an end to the broadcast, and I would like to do it by asking you a question that might not be the easiest one, but it might be helpful to some people out there. Are there any records in particular that you recommend that people need to listen to of Harry James? And I'm sorry, maybe I could have mentioned this before so that you could prepare this, but some records, some CD, some LP that comes to mind that people definitely need to have on their shelves.
Well, it's not easy because I have so many favorites. When I perform, for many, many years, people would say, "What's your favorite Frank Sinatra song to sing?" And after a while, I actually had to think about it. And I came to the conclusion that my favorite one was "All My Tomorrows" from the 1958 movie Hole in the Head.
Good choice.
But as far as Harry James records, many of the albums were never reissued, but there's a lot of them that are available on CD. There's one that just came out recently, and I'm proud of it because I got my name in my Harry James Facebook group mentioned inside of it. But it's called Mona Lisa and Other Rarities. Mm-hmm. And it's Columbia recordings that were never put on an album. They were released as singles, and that was it. And that's a good one. You can still get his last 3 albums, which were the Sheffield Lab recordings, King James version, still Harry after all these years, and Coming from a Good Place. Those are still available to purchase on Amazon, or you can find them on eBay or something. And a lot of people want to hear his greatest hits, and all of his greatest hits have been reissued and reissued. So they're out there. All you got to do is a simple search on either Amazon or eBay, and you can find them. And as far as personal favorites, if you can get a copy of the Golden Trumpet of Harry James, which is still available on CD, that's a 1967 recording that really changed my life. It was London Phase 4 stereo. It was the best sounding recording that Harry had ever made at that point. And it's just, the band was just on fire, and it's a great record to have.
I love listening, besides what you're mentioning, to some of the air checks from the 1940s, big band broadcasts.
I have a lot of those on YouTube. If you go to my YouTube channel, you can hear radio broadcasts all the way up until 1971. Mm-hmm. I have a live air shot of Harry James on New Year's Eve in Las Vegas at the Desert Inn, and I have put the entire radio broadcast on my YouTube channel.
I love those particularly because sometimes they're so different from the commercial studio versions, and in some cases the band is absolutely on fire and has plenty of room to improvise and to play different stuff that's not. That's right. That's not on the record for that reason, and that's one of the reasons why I love those old air checks from the big band years. Chuck, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and having you guest on the Jazz Flashes podcast. And thank you very much as well for the book, Harry James, Trumpet Icon, that you just published on Amazon. And I want to take the time now to recommend it to everybody out there. I don't think you'll be disappointed in the least, because this is the kind of book about Harry James that we needed. And the author is Chuck Pardue. Thank you, Chuck, for being here, and thank you for your generosity and your time.
For letting me share the stories, and I really enjoyed talking to you. I hope I get to talk to you again.
Well, I hope so too, and the microphones of the Jazz Flashers podcast will always be open to you anytime you want to come back, that's for sure.
Thank you.
This has been a new episode of the Jazz Flashers podcast. Our guest today has been Chuck Pardue, the author of Harry James, Trumpet Icon, that you can find on Amazon.com, the new and extremely interesting biography of Harry James, the iconic jazz trumpeter, swing trumpeter, and one of my favorite musicians of all time. My name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez. Mine is the copyright of this broadcast, Jazz Flashers podcast, which was recorded live in Jackson, Tennessee, in the United States of America in the month of May of the year 2020. Time to dust off those Harry James records right now, and of course, we'll see you again before too long on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, and on the Jazz Flashers podcast. Thank you so much for your attention, and so long, everybody.